Picture this. You wake up one morning, eyes watering, nose running, throat scratchy. You reach for an antihistamine, curse the pollen count, and drag yourself through the day convinced that your immune system has declared war on harmless particles floating through the air, and then a question hits you. Did people always live like this? Did some hunter-gatherer sitting outside a cave 10,000 years ago sneeze into the morning mist and wonder what was wrong with him? Or is this misery something new, something we made? Because here is what is strange. Allergies are one of the fastest-growing health crises in the modern world. In the United States alone, over 100 million people suffer from allergic conditions every single year. Rates of asthma, hay fever, eczema, and food allergies have roughly doubled in wealthy countries over the last few decades. Children today are far more likely to carry an EpiPen than children in 1980, far more likely than children in 1950, and almost incomparably more affected than any human being who lived before indoor plumbing. So what happened? And more importantly, what does the deep history of the human immune system tell us about why our bodies are turning against us now? The answer reaches back hundreds of thousands of years, deep into the evolutionary wiring of a species that had to survive in a world that was trying to kill it from every direction at once. Let us start with what an allergy actually is, because the word gets thrown around casually in ways that blur the real picture. An allergic reaction is your immune system mounting a full-scale defensive response against something that poses no genuine threat: pollen, peanut protein, cat dander, dust mite feces. Your body processes these as dangerous invaders and deploys the same heavy artillery it would use against a parasite trying to burrow through your intestinal wall. The sneezing, the swelling, the mucus, the itching, all of it is friendly fire. Your immune system doing its job spectacularly, catastrophically wrong. The specific mechanism involves a type of antibody called immunoglobulin E, or IgE. When your immune system first encounters something it mistakenly flags as dangerous, it produces IgE antibodies tuned precisely to that molecule. Those antibodies attach to mast cells throughout your body, essentially loading them like weapons. The next time that same molecule appears, the IgE-coated mast cells detonate, releasing histamine and a cascade of other inflammatory chemicals. That is the allergic response. Fast, violent, and in severe cases, life-threatening. Now here's the evolutionary puzzle. Why would natural selection preserve a system that can kill you over a peanut? The answer lies in what IgE evolved to fight: parasitic worms, helminths, organisms like hookworms, roundworms, tapeworms, and liver flukes that spent millions of years co-evolving with vertebrate immune systems in an arms race of attack and counterattack. These parasites are large, they do not replicate like viruses or bacteria, and they require a very different immune strategy to manage. IgE-mediated responses, the mucus production, the inflammation, the violent expulsion reflexes are precisely calibrated to fight worms. They are not mistakes. They are a finely tuned ancient defense. For most of human evolutionary history, this system was kept busy. Parasitic worm infections were essentially universal. Archaeologists and paleoparasitologists have found preserved helminth eggs in ancient feces, in mummified intestinal tissue, and in sediment layers from prehistoric settlements on every inhabited continent. Studies of hunter-gatherer populations, pre-agricultural peoples, and individuals living in environments similar to ancient conditions consistently show helminth infection rates approaching 100%. If you were a human being living before modern sanitation, clean water infrastructure, and anti-parasitic medicine, worms were a permanent feature of your internal landscape. Your IgE system, in that context, was not misfiring. It was perpetually engaged, kept in a state of productive focus by real, ongoing threats. The system was occupied. There was no bandwidth left for pollen. This is the foundation of what immunologists call the hygiene hypothesis, first articulated in the late 1980s by epidemiologist David Strachan, and significantly refined and expanded in the decades since. The core insight is this: the human immune system did not evolve expecting to operate in a sterile environment. It evolved expecting to be continuously challenged by parasites, bacteria, and environmental organisms from the first moments of life. When that challenge disappears, the system does not stand down, it redirects. The more precise and scientifically updated version of this idea is sometimes called the old friends hypothesis, proposed by immunologist Graham Rook. The argument is not simply that we need to be exposed to dirt or germs in general. It is that we need exposure to specific organisms, the ones that co-evolved with our lineage over millions of years. Helminths, certain soil bacteria like Mycobacterium vaccae, The microorganisms that colonize the guts, skin, and respiratory tracts of our ancestors in stable, long-term relationships that shaped how the immune system learned to calibrate itself. Without those old friends, the immune system loses its reference points. It loses the regulatory signals that told it, over millions of years of experience, what was worth fighting and what was safe to ignore. Ancient humans almost certainly did experience some version of allergic response. The biological machinery was there, IgE existed, mast cells existed, the inflammatory cascade existed, but the clinical picture would have looked radically different from what we experience now for one simple reason. The system had something real to do. A body carrying a hookworm load and a gut microbiome shaped by lifelong exposure to soil organisms and fermented foods and river water is not the same immunological environment as a body raised on pasteurized food, in a climate-controlled apartment, with antibiotics taken multiple times before age 5. There is another layer here that goes even deeper than the parasite story. Geneticists studying ancient human DNA have found signatures of natural selection in immune-related genes, including genes involved in the IgE response, that correspond to major transitions in human prehistory. One of the most striking shifts appears around the time populations moved into high-density agricultural settlements, roughly 10,000 years ago. Dense living conditions, proximity to domesticated animals, shared water sources, and stored grain created entirely new pathogen pressures. Immune genes adapted. The systems that had been tuned for a nomadic lifestyle reconfigured themselves, imperfectly and rapidly, for a world of villages and farms. And then industrialization hit, and the pace of environmental change accelerated beyond anything natural selection could track. Within a handful of generations, sanitation systems eliminated most endemic parasites in wealthy countries. Antibiotics reshaped the gut microbiome. Cesarean birth delivery altered the microbial communities passed from mother to child at the moment of birth. Ultra-processed food replaced the fermented, fiber-rich diets that fed the microbial ecosystems in human intestines for hundreds of thousands of years. Indoor living cut exposure to soil organisms that had been constant companions of the human body for the entirety of primate evolution. The immune system inherited from ancient humans found itself suddenly unemployed, running its complex regulatory machinery in an environment stripped of the inputs it had always used to calibrate itself, and the consequences showed up in clinical statistics within decades. There is a strand of evidence from modern populations that makes this strikingly concrete. Studies of children raised on traditional farms in Europe, particularly Amish and Old Order Mennonite communities in the United States and farming communities in Switzerland and Germany, show dramatically lower rates of allergic disease compared to children raised in urban or suburban environments. And the difference is not primarily genetic. It appears to come from early and continuous exposure to animal barns, raw, unpasteurized milk, and the diverse microbial communities that come with living in close contact with livestock and soil. Similarly, studies of populations in parts of Africa and South America where helminth infections remain common consistently show low rates of allergic disease, even in individuals who carry genetic risk factors that in wealthy countries would strongly predict asthma or hay fever. Introduce antiparasitic treatment, and allergic sensitization begins to rise over subsequent generations. The old immune balance, enforced by the presence of the old enemies, dissolves. There are researchers now actively investigating whether controlled, therapeutic exposure to helminths, species that are relatively harmless to humans like the whipworm Trichuris suis or the hookworm Necator americanus, might actually treat allergic and autoimmune conditions in modern patients. Early clinical trials have shown some promising results, particularly for inflammatory bowel disease and certain allergic conditions. The idea that the cure for a hyperactive immune system might be a carefully dosed worm infection is deeply counterintuitive by modern standards. By the standards of human evolutionary history, it is simply returning the system to the conditions it was designed for. What this history suggests about the deep past is both humbling and clarifying. Ancient humans were not free of immune dysfunction. They suffered from inflammatory diseases. They died of infections that modern medicine handles routinely. But the specific modern epidemic of allergic disease, the child who cannot eat a peanut, the adult who cannot walk through a park in May, the infant whose skin erupts in eczema before her first birthday, these patterns reflect a mismatch between an ancient immune system and a radically new environment, not an eternal feature of human biology. The sneezing ancestor outside the cave was almost certainly not allergic to pollen, not because his immune system was superior, but because his body was busy. The old enemies were there, doing their terrible, inadvertently useful job. His IgE antibodies were deployed against organisms with actual teeth. The pollen drifting past his face registered as irrelevant, because in the immunological context of his life, it was. We dismantled that context within a few generations. We did it with clean water and vaccines and sanitation systems and anti-parasitic drugs. And we did it for excellent reasons, because the diseases we eliminated were genuinely terrible. Nobody who understands what a parasitic worm infection actually does to a human body is arguing we should bring them back wholesale. But understanding what we lost in the process, the calibration, the regulatory balance enforced by a lifetime of coexistence with old evolutionary companions, is essential to understanding why so many immune systems in the modern world seem to be running untethered. The immune system is not broken. It is doing exactly what evolution shaped it to do. It is searching for enemies in an environment that has, historically speaking, almost overnight, stripped of the enemies it was built to fight. And when it cannot find them, it invents them. A protein in a peanut, a molecule released by a grass, a fragment of dead skin shed by a house cat. The ghost of ancient parasites haunts every sneeze. Which brings us to where the science is headed now. Researchers are not just studying helminth therapy. They are looking at the microbiome in extraordinary detail, mapping the specific microbial species that appear protective against allergic disease, investigating whether early life exposure to diverse environments can reset immune calibration before the allergic trajectory locks in, and examining whether dietary interventions that restore ancestral fiber intake can rebuild the gut microbial ecosystems that regulate immune tone. None of this is simple. The immune system is not a dial you can just turn back. 10,000 years of agricultural living, 200 years of industrialization, and 5 decades of processed food have left their marks on human microbiomes in ways that are not easily reversed. But the framework that emerges from the evolutionary history is clear. The human immune system is not malfunctioning. It is operating in the wrong century, and the path forward almost certainly involves understanding the ancient conditions that shaped it and finding modern ways to approximate what our bodies never stopped expecting to find. The ancestor outside the cave sneezed in the cold morning air, reached up instinctively, and went back to what he was doing. Ours, in the most sanitized moment in human history, is still looking for a fight